The most fundamental bias you will encounter amongst journalists in the mainstream press is neither left nor right, is neither liberal nor conservative. The most fundamental bias is the desire to have a story to tell. In wanting to have a story to tell, the journalist will choose a compelling story, a dramatic story, a story that comes to a clear conclusion, that has contrasts of good and evil, over a story that's ambiguous, ambivalent, uncertain, dissipated, aimless, morally confusing. There's a choosing of the story to be told, and then there's the journalist's effort to present himself or herself as having enough expertise to tell that story. In the case of the recent events in Kurdistan, in northern Syria, northern Iraq, bordering areas of Turkey and so on, the Kurdistani fable being told by the mainstream press is false. And it's false whether it's being told from the far left, the moderate left and liberals, or the conservatives. I've seen absolutely nothing but lies here. And you know, there's this old hackneyed phrase, learning the lessons of history. You don't have to go back too far in history to learn the lessons, to understand what's really been happening with Iraqi Kurdistan, with various Kurdistanic areas. 2017 was not all that long ago. Let's just pretend this is hypothetical. Let's just say, hypothetically, in the year 2017, there was a vote in Iraqi Kurdistan. There was a referendum where the public were invited to vote on whether or not they would prefer to be an independent country in the future. So that's the kind of event, that's the kind of political event that takes a long time to stage manage. So everyone in the so-called international community had their opportunity to state their case, to state their position on it. So Barack Obama, at the end of his term, had his chance to speak on it. And then actually that vote, the referendum, took place after the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was in office. He had his opportunity to speak. The Prime Minister of France, England, Germany, they all could have taken a moral position, one way or another, on the question of Kurdistan becoming an independent country. You know what? They had their referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it was followed up by a civil war. A civil war that anyone in the so-called international community could have intervened in, or could have at least made a statement about. The opportunity for the Western powers to make their policy position clear on the future of the Kurds already came and went, and it's not ancient history. It was made absolutely clear to anyone paying attention in the year 2017. If there had been any doubt in your mind before, what was the policy position of George W. Bush on the future of Kurdistan? What was the position of Barack Obama on the future of Kurdistan? Anyone who even asked themselves this question knew the answer. There never was any ambiguity. But in case you were kidding yourself that this was in any way ambiguous, it was made completely unambiguously clear in 2017 with the referendum and the brief but decisive civil war that happened thereafter. Hashtag spoilers. In case you didn't know, Iraq won the civil war. They suppressed the Kurdish independence movement. They changed the borders. They took back direct control of some very important oil fields, economically important, strategically important. That was the end of the prospect of an independent Kurdistan. And all the Western powers, including Donald Trump himself, sitting in the White House, made their position clear. They are opposed to, they do not now support, they never have supported Kurdish independence, the creation of a new sovereign state for the Kurdish people. Never have. Right? So the first fundamental lie in the current press coverage of what's happening in northern Syria and all of the adjacent areas with the Kurds, the first lie is saying that the United States have abandoned Kurdish independence, Kurdish nationalism, that they've abandoned it, as if in the past they supported it. Okay, I'm sorry. If you had even said that in 2017, that would have seemed incredibly naive, incredibly jejune. Anyone who really knows politics and cares politics could have taken you aside and said, no, come on. Are you kidding? This was never the playbook. I'm sorry. At what point did George W. Bush say to the American people that they were committed to fighting a war for the independence of the Kurdish people, to create a Kurdish homeland? Does that sound like something you can remember George W. Bush saying? At what point did Barack Obama commit to something like that, or ask for a debate in the Senate about America's official position on Kurdish independence? Never happened. Right? It was never even entertained. Now, you can talk about why that is. You can talk about the strategic factors that incline various Western powers to make those decisions. I think the more important question is not to ask why that decision is made. It's to ask who decides. And this is where we begin to question this terrible fiction, this powerful fable of our times. This is where we begin to question what is meant by, quote unquote, the international community. The international community is an abstract term we use to console ourselves for the decisions that we, the public, do not make, that we are not privy to, decisions that politicians are not accountable to us for, that are not transparent, that we do not participate in. We are never asked to vote in a referendum. That's a contrast to Iraqi Kurdistan. They at least got a referendum. Did anyone ever ask the American people to vote on a referendum? Would you or would you not be willing for the next 5 years to support a war to prevent the Taliban from coming back to power in Afghanistan? That's a meaningful question to put to the American public. And maybe how many $1 million are you willing to commit, and maybe how many thousands of troops, whatever it is. That would be a really meaningful question to put the American public in a referendum. What if you put to the public in a referendum in the United States, are you willing to invade and conquer Syria in order to replace the regime of Bashar al-Assad with another, more democratic form of government? Would Americans vote in favor of that? Would Americans in the year 2016 have voted in favor of that proposal? There never was a referendum. The public were never consulted. The international community decides this thing. There is this vague abstraction of the international community, partly comprised of elected officials, yes, partly comprised of unelected technocrats and bureaucrats who meet in secret behind closed doors to make these decisions on your behalf with implications for you. Your sons and daughters die fighting the wars. Your governments are bankrupted by the billions in military budget being spent on it, so on and so forth. But even if those meetings, even if the decisions made by quote unquote the international community, even if those decisions were entirely made by elected officials, it's impossible for the public to choose that elected official and hold them to account for a specific foreign policy decision, like war in Syria, war in Iraq, war to create a homeland for the Kurds, a future Kurdistan. It's impossible. If you ask someone in Germany, why did you vote for this person as prime minister? They have to say back to you, oh, well, I liked his position on healthcare, or I liked her position on the economy. There's going to be a long list of issues packaged up into one ball, and then they have to make that decision for who's in charge. They cannot vote for or against one president or another, one prime minister or another, one leader or another, on the basis of something as specific as their policy in Afghanistan, their policy in Syria, their policy for the Kurds, right? So you must have direct democracy. You must have disambiguated democracy, where people know the decision they're making and they make that decision. A lot of people felt that they were voting for Donald Trump because he was the anti-war candidate. I remember those debates. They were surreal. It was very clear Hillary Clinton was promising forever war. The war would go on forever. More wars in North Africa, wars in Syria. Hillary Clinton was the pro-war candidate. And it's surreal to say now, looking back, but Donald Trump presented himself as, and he was perceived as, being relatively cautious about war, relatively skeptical of war. He was the candidate saying that he wanted to bring back American troops from Afghanistan, from Syria, etc., that these things had gone on for long enough. He made various incoherent comments at that time. He's still making incoherent comments now that one way or another he wants peace or at least less war. So the deception presented by the mainstream press right now is in two parts that fit together very poorly. The first part of the argument is that the Kurds always were the allies of the United States, and all kinds of wonderful things are then said about the Kurds. Many of them are not true. For example, it's said that they're secular. Why, they're hardly Muslim at all. Yeah, they're called secular when they're being contrasted to the Islamic State and other really extremist fundamentalist Muslims. Come on, you gotta have your head examined. Anyway, every possible form of praise is heaped on the Kurds and their ethno-nationalist movement to have a nation state based on their language and national identity. All kinds of positive things about them that left-wingers would never say about Israel, which is also a country based on an ethno-nationalist ideal powerfully linked to a religious identity. Strange, inconsistent thing here. Every possible positive thing is said about the Kurds. They're described as having been America's allies continuously until one day Donald Trump sent out these tweets. And again, absolutely no Google level knowledge of what happened, even as recently as 2017. Completely intentional blindness to the whole history of the last 20 years. Regardless, we continue. And yet, if you keep reading a little bit further down the page of the same newspaper, what you'll find is the admission that as soon as the United States of America made it clear they would no longer be supporting any side in northern Syria, that they would be evacuating their troops, the Kurds immediately, almost that very day, took up negotiations to switch sides and begin openly supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, to begin openly working with and allying themselves with the Russians. Now, the extent to which Donald Trump and the Russians were ever on opposite sides in Syria is going to be an interesting question for historians to puzzle at. Even during the election debates, before Donald Trump was elected, he openly said that he saw the Russian presence there as being positive because Russia and the United States both were opposed to ISIS, the Islamic State, that he thought the Russians could be some sort of civilizing, stabilizing force in the region. And maybe he was right. It remains to be seen. But the notion that the Kurds ever had any love or commitment or fealty to the United States, or that the United States ever had any fealty or commitment to the Kurds, it's very difficult to sustain this illusion, even when we're just looking at the events of the past 1 month in detail, let alone when we're looking at the events of, say, the last 3 years in detail. Coming back to my initial point in this video, I don't think the journalists are doing this out of left-wing bias or conservative bias. I see the conservatives telling much the same lies at the moment for whatever reason. I think the fundamental bias they're trapped in is the desire to have a story to tell, and then to tell whatever the most compelling, the most emotionally moving story possible might be. There's less and less interest in the truth. There's less and less interest in problem solving. Problem solving is fundamentally a very undramatic attitude towards a situation. It's very humbling. When you say, okay, this is a situation with problems. What can we do to help? What can we do to make it better? The answer to that question may be very humbling indeed. The United States made the decision, cynically or not, a long time ago, that they were not going to create a separate state for the Kurds. They could have done it in northern Iraq most easily during the period in which they were occupying Iraq through military invasion and conquest. They decided not to do that, and there are considerations here, like, well, if you create a separate state for the Kurds, then probably Turkey will leave NATO. If Turkey exits NATO, then the conflict between Turkey and Greece, Turkey and Cyprus, all of that heats up. The relationship between Turkey and Israel is also some strategic importance. The relationship between the United States and Iraq is of strategic importance. And even though you may think the Iraqi government is entirely a creature of American intervention, those relations could break down. Iraq could move closer to Iran. Both Iraq and Iran would actually be unified with one common interest, fighting against a newly independent Kurdistan. Yeah. Once you start placing out the dominoes on the field, you start to see a lot of cynical, Machiavellian reasons why, quote unquote, the international community would never make this decision to promote the creation of an independent Kurdish homeland, apart from the general principle of the thing of whether or not creating nation states based on ethnicity is a good idea in the 21st century. The international community also has no interest in supporting the Khmer Krom being returned to Cambodia. They have no interest in Shan State becoming a separate country from Myanmar. It's a pretty long list of ethnic independence movements that could be supported by the international community, but are not. Let's just take this down to the lowest level of the hoi polloi, the members of the mob, once more. The wonderful thing about democracy is that if you let people vote in a referendum on these issues, they won't think about it in those Machiavellian terms at all. I think the majority of American people would not vote in favor of a new war in northern Syria. I think the majority of American people would not vote to support the creation of a separate homeland, a separate country for the Kurds. And you know what? I think they'd come to that decision in part on the basis of principle and in part on the basis of self-interest. But I don't think they'd give the slightest thought to the cynical, Machiavellian, geostrategic considerations that currently are lurking behind this pleasing appearance we have of the so-called international community supposedly making decisions on our behalf for the greater good on a charitable basis behind closed doors. Guys, democracy. Either you've got it or you don't.